I'd now like to introduce Brad Carlin, Senior Consultant at TRG Arts. Today, Brad will be sharing the latest insights from the TRG Arts and Culture Benchmark, an ongoing international data set that reveals the current state of arts and culture organizations in Canada, the US, and around the world. A growing number of Canadian orchestras are now taking part, contributing to the data set, but there's always room for more. I'm now going to pass the mic to Brad. Over to you.
Thanks, Catherine, and thank you all for spending a bit of your morning or afternoon, wherever you are, with me today to talk about some data. I'm very excited to share what we've learned so far about the 25-26 season and a deep dive into the 2025 holiday concert season as well as a part of today's discussion. I, again, as echoing Catherine's comments, and encourage questions and comments and provocations in the chat. There is time for us to get to some of this, so it doesn't have to all be charts and graphs. Would love to have an opportunity for a discussion when we get towards the end of our hour together. But until then, let's dive into the data. So first, as Catherine mentioned, this data comes from our Arts and Culture Benchmark. The Arts and Culture Benchmark currently consists of a little more than 400 organizations across the UK, the US, and Canada. Yes, increasingly a presence from Canadian organizations, including Canadian orchestras, and would love to have more. There's information on our website about how to join. It's free to participate in the Arts and Culture Benchmark. It will allow you to see your organization's data compared against those in a cohort of other similar organizations. Maybe not something you'd want to look at every single day, but definitely a resource as you reflect on trends over time within your organization and trying to get that sense of just how normal are we compared to others who may be in a similar field as us. In terms of the data that we'll be looking at today, it's a slice of that wider arts and culture benchmark. So we're going to be looking at 43 North American orchestras, so orchestras from the US and Canada, with consistent data between July 2021 to December 2025. This was important for us to make sure that we had a consistent representation of similar organizations across the study period. So that's why we're just looking at a slice of the data. In particular, we will be reviewing and digging into single tickets and donations through a time frame of July to December 2025. The intention here is to try to align with the timing of when transactions take place for the season folks are in right now. Most of us are in a 25-26 programming season, and so we're looking in particular at single tickets and donations within that range. We will also compare this to similar periods of time from 23 and 24. As I mentioned, we will do a deep dive into holiday tickets. There, we are focusing on concerts and performances that took place between November and December of 2025. And even more specifically, we are looking at concerts that, as best we can tell, have holiday-themed programming to them. So we're looking at titles of the programs and determining how holiday is it, how Christmas, New Year's, that type of winter programming. So we'll make specific investigations into holiday pops types of concerts, looking at the Messiah concerts as well, some of the usual suspects, and then other holiday themed programming that aren't those kind of those old stalwarts of our holiday calendars. With similar comparisons to 23 and 24. Important to note, though, that when we are looking at that deep dive into holiday tickets, is that we are looking at all tickets in that particular analysis, so single ticket buyers as well as subscribers and members. We'll do a look at subscription as well, subscription and membership, and the date range there is February to December. Again, we're aligning that with the transactions that would be taking place for the subscription campaigns for the 25-26 season. That is almost a full year's worth of data, not quite, but should give us a pretty good sense of what the 12-month period of subscription sales for the current season is looking like. And again, with similar comparisons from 2 years prior. In a handful of slides, we will make some comparisons, some contextual comparisons to the wider performing arts benchmark. And so what's included here are 142 North American organizations in theater, performing arts centers, dance companies, opera companies, ballet, and other music organizations that are non-symphony orchestras. So the orchestra, the 43 North American orchestras we're looking at are not included in that particular set of the benchmark. So that will just provide a little bit of context to how North American orchestras are stacking up compared to the wider performing arts sector. One last bit of preamble about the data. Let's talk inflation, friends. This data includes inflation-adjusted revenue figures. So all of the revenue figures that you will see for previous years have been adjusted for inflation and are shown in 2025 US dollars. And so what we're doing there is trying to be able to just understand with taking inflation into account. And so I'm just wanting to flag that. Now inflation's been a big part of the story over the last few years, and so that has been incorporated into the analysis. Now we can talk about charts and graphs. Let's start with single tickets, and and again, that time period we're looking at here is July to December of last year. On this first chart, big picture here, we are looking at tickets and revenue for single tickets, July to December. So the green bars are the ticket volume in the axis on the left. Revenue is the green line with the axis on the right. And I know all this excitement around charts and graphs, and the first one I show you is one that actually looks kind of boring. It's kind of stable, it's steady, right? And while that may be a relief for many to see such stability relative to what we've been through as a sector over the past, I don't know, 6 years or so, this could be interpreted as an encouraging sign or a challenging sign, depending on where you are in your recovery. I'm sure many organizations would love to see stability, but many organizations are needing to also do better than just being stable right now, who are still needing to achieve significant recovery coming out of the pandemic. But as a whole, again, the 40 or so organizations that we are looking at have seen largely stable ticket volume and largely stable ticket revenues over the past few years. So it's just a 1% increase when comparing 23 to 25 in terms of tickets and revenue. However, this level of stability is not necessarily being seen in the other performing arts genres and disciplines that we study in the benchmark. So orchestras have achieved relative stability, but others have struggled. I think the takeaway I'd offer here, and one of the biggest differences, has been how quickly and effectively orchestras have responded to inflationary pressures within their revenues in ways that other sectors haven't. It's taken other sectors a longer time to adjust their revenues and probably adjust their pricing strategies to keep pace or to catch up with inflation. But the orchestras sector in general has done a relatively good job, and which means they're not digging themselves quite out of quite the hole that perhaps other disciplines are. Speaking of average ticket prices, this next chart is a look at the average ticket price paid. So it's also what we call per capita revenue. Looking at that trend over the past three years within the first half of each of those seasons. As a reminder, these revenue figures have already been adjusted for inflation, so you are looking at the equivalent of 2025 dollars in those previous years. And so the growth here is encouraging. We've seen real growth in the average ticket price paid in the orchestras that we're looking at here. That's a 6% increase in per capita revenue between 23 and 25 that has outpaced inflation, um, which has really helped orchestras recover and keep revenues relatively stable. It's also encouraging to see that if you recall back to the other slide, that ticket volume has remained relatively stable, maybe a little bit of growth, which has been achieved in a moment where there has been, um, meaningful average price paid increases taking place as well. So the average price paid has been going up, and ticket volume has been able to be steady or even rising just a little bit. The big jump you see there on the bottom from other performing arts has been the catch up, really, that they've had to do on catching up with inflation, which has come much later in this recovery period coming out of COVID than orchestras. So that's largely why you're seeing that 13% increase in their per caps. But if you recall back to the previous slide, their revenues are still down 8%. Now we're wanting to look at the relationships, the households that we have buying single tickets, and how many tickets are they buying on average when they purchase. And so the purple bar here represents the number of households who are buying single tickets within the orchestras we studied. The gold line represents the average number of tickets per order. And so that corresponds to the axis on the right. More good news here is that the number of households buying tickets has increased consistently over the past few seasons, at least in the first half of the past few seasons. So you can see that number going up about 5% between 23 and 25. However, and this metric, I think, is a really important one to be thinking about, not just in the sector, but within your individual organizations. It's this downward trend in the average tickets per order. This has been a consistent trend coming out of COVID, and that decline has been pretty steady. There are a lot of possible reasons for why this is happening. Part of it could be the decline in the groups market. So group sales would be contributing to this. This is something that was happening before COVID. We've seen this after COVID. Just fundamental changes in the group sales market is pulling that average down just a little bit. That may or may not be a big part of the business in your orchestra, but for those who rely heavily on group sales, it's been a challenging part of the market for some time. The other element here could be just changing behavior. We have had different types of audiences engaging in different ways coming out of the pandemic. And so part of that could mean we have a reliance, a bit more of a reliance perhaps on new audiences on this side of the pandemic than we did before. New audiences tend to engage less frequently in buying fewer tickets when they do. So that could be contributing to this. It could also just be existing audiences changing their behavior, perhaps responding to increases in price, although we can't prove or show that per se, that as average ticket prices with inflation have needed to rise, but they've risen beyond inflation. So while that's good for our revenue streams, one hypothesis is that could be having an impact on order size, as perhaps enough customers are changing the numbers of tickets that they're buying when they're attending the orchestra, and it's reducing the number of tickets that they're buying. What all of this means in practice is that linking some of these slides together, what you see here, more people buying tickets, that's great. But as they're buying tickets, they're buying fewer tickets each time. So even that is basically canceling out the growth there. If you think back to that first slide where the total ticket volume was the same, we've got more people, but they're buying fewer tickets each time they buy, and we're basically treading water with the volume of tickets in the sector. So while it's incredibly encouraging to be increasing the number of people that we are in relationship with in our sector, it is a challenge because it is hard work to bring more and more people and to manage those relationships, and it takes a great deal of investment from our marketing teams. That we are struggling a bit to increase ticket volume, in part because of this metric here. Even increasing ticket prices, more people buying tickets, helping us keep that revenue figure largely flat. But our halls are not necessarily, in the aggregate, more full than they were just a few seasons ago, despite us reaching more people. So this is a really important metric that we've been studying for a few years now and want to make sure that we're giving adequate attention to. The other important metric in terms of determining the behavior that has a big factor in how many and how full our seats are is frequency. So the number of times on average, how many concerts are single ticket buyers attending. And this is flat, 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 right? So we'd love to see this frequency number increase, but at least it's not falling. And so this is the last piece of the puzzle that helps us really hone in on the last metric that I was looking at as being a really important factor in why we haven't seen more ticket volume growth. Frequency has been relatively flat. Households have been increasing, but the number of tickets that they're buying hasn't. And so it is that metric that seems to be the biggest driver in why ticket sales have been flat. If we could grow frequency of single ticket buyers, which is important because that is a pipeline to subscription, all of our future subscribers, if they aren't subscribing now, our best prospects for future subscription are going to be these higher frequency single ticket buyers. So if we can grow frequency, we'll grow the number of people who can refill that subscription pipeline. At the moment, we're treading water on frequency, despite the fact that we're reaching more people. And so all of this goes into the stew, ingredients into the stew around what's happening on the single ticket side of things. That comparison with the other performing arts, it's a pretty big decline. I dug into that a bit, and 23 was a bit of an outlier elsewhere in other sectors that I'm not sure why that was an abnormally high frequency figure in that particular period. And then since then, the 24 and 25 years have been really flat and comparable to what we're seeing in the orchestra field. So really the main reason that 9% number is there is really because 23 was an outlier and we happen to be comparing the first and last year in the study period. Beyond that, it's been a pretty similar story in the wider performing arts sectors. Okay, so some takeaways from what we're seeing on single tickets. Yes, more buyers, revenue, the price they're paying is growing, but unfortunately the ticket volume is flat, and so revenues are also staying flat. So there are good things happening here that at least frequency is remaining flat, even though we're driving more households, and we're able to get more people buying tickets to attend concerts. That's a really good health indicator for the sector. We will take that. But as I mentioned, we have the biggest area of concern here is around reductions in the order size. That has been a real challenge, and so there's opportunities here for organizations to be thinking about how that metric is impacting their business and where in their offerings and in their single ticket offerings is perhaps average tickets per order an important metric to be watching and trying to address through campaign activity. Deeper dive now into our holiday sales. So remember, this is November and December 2025. We're primarily focusing on concerts that we've been able to identify largely through the title of the program as ones that were clearly including holiday-focused, end-of-year, winter holiday-focused content in them. So it's not necessarily everything we were doing around this time period, but specifically focusing on that holiday-centric programming from November and December 25. Similar chart as before, just trying to get a lay of the land here in terms of tickets and revenue. So we've got ticket volume in the green, ticket revenue in the green, ticket volume in the teal there with the bars. We're comparing November and December over the past 3 seasons. Ticket revenue down just a bit in 25. It had been relatively stable between 23 and 24, so perhaps just could be a 1-year fluctuation. We'll dig into some circumstances around that in a moment. So tickets down 3%, but revenue only down 2%. So my math nerds in the Zoom room are already figuring out that there could be something going on there with the per capita revenue. And you're right, there is. So we'll get into that in a moment. We've seen a bit more growth from the wider performing arts sector on similar types of programming in the year, but maybe not as strong a story there on the per capita revenue side. You can see that is an indicator when, let's say, tickets are growing faster than revenue, means something's going on with the per cap. Just like for orchestras, when tickets are declining by 3, but revenue is only declining by 2, it means we've seen some growth in that per capita revenue. So some interesting things to take into account. The holiday season is a very specific, precise time of year that is impacted. The sales are impacted by things we can't control, namely the calendar for one. So one thing in looking at the differences between these two seasons at the beginning and end of our study period is the number of days that we have to both sell, but also the number of days we have for to have our concerts, to present our work. That period we've defined as a prime holiday period, which we define as the number of days between American Thanksgiving and Christmas. And because of when those days fall in calendars, that period of time, that prime holiday season, is sometimes longer and sometimes it contracts. But that is a big driver in terms of our ability to deliver a certain volume of programming. It just so happens that in these calendar cycles, that the comparison between 23 and 25, 25 is 14% smaller, just fewer days in that period. And as such, we noticed there were 7% fewer concerts taking place. And as we all know, if we have fewer concerts, we are going to sell fewer tickets. We broke that programming out, those concerts out into two buckets. Basically, we've got the Holiday Pops and Messiah concerts, that core holiday programming, and then everything else, all the other holiday programming. And what we've seen is that even though there's a 7% reduction in concerts overall, orchestras leaned into that Holiday Pops and Messiah content more. They actually increased the number of concerts within that particular rep in 25 compared to 23, while reducing the other stuff, basically, and in reducing the other stuff in ways comparable to the amount of time. Now, there's a good question about correlation versus causation there, but it's interesting that that's where the contraction took place and orchestras actually leaned into trying to provide more of the Holiday Pops and Messiah concerts in 25 versus 23. And just putting that into context with what we saw with the wider ticket trends for holiday season programming, where we saw a 3% decline in tickets, but only a 2% decline in revenue, which means there it is, there's that 1% increase in per capita revenue. Piecing this all together, it's interesting to see and encouraging to see. The good news takeaway from this that we see is that a contraction of concerts, opportunities to sell tickets, contracted by 7%, but the number of tickets we sold only declined by 3%. And because orchestras have been effective and efficient at keeping that per capita revenue growing faster than inflation, the revenue implications of having fewer concerts was even smaller than that. So in a way, is a really encouraging sign of how orchestras are adapting to conditions we can't necessarily control within the holiday season. We've lost important real estate in terms of offering concerts and selling concerts, but been able to mitigate those losses by turning up the volume on core successful product like Holiday Pops and Messiah, by managing our average ticket prices well to mitigate the potential downsides of a contracted holiday season. That story told a bit here, just looking at the differences between the other holiday content and the Holiday Pops and Messiah content. So you can see the tickets sold for the other programming in that light green. You can see the tickets for Holiday Pops and Messiah in the light blue, and then the number of concerts in the lines above. So obviously the Holiday Pops and Messiah concerts are still a smaller proportion of the holiday programming. There are a smaller volume of tickets, but that balance has definitely shifted in 2025 compared to previous years. And so what we've seen here is so I'm looking at the arrows on the right-hand side. When we're just looking at changes amongst holiday pops and Messiah concerts between 23 and 24, we've got 4% more concerts, but 7% more tickets, 7% more revenue. The other programming has declined by 14% in terms of the concerts, but only a 10% decline in tickets and only an 8% decline in revenue. So again, all of these factors coming into play here, incredibly efficient, right? For there to be only 4% more concerts, but we're able to grow tickets and revenue by 7% in our Holiday Pops and Messiah product. This suggests, for at least in aggregate, that those concerts would have been more full, right? If we're only growing the number of concerts by 4%, but we're able to grow the tickets by 7, that's incredibly efficient and encouraging. And likewise, we contracted the number of concerts in the other holiday programming by 14%, but only had a 10% decline in the number of tickets and an even better 8% decline in revenue. So still holding the line around this. And one of the hypotheses here that we have is just in understanding the other side of the equation on this type of programming. So other holiday programming can often mean, this is film scores or big kind of one-off events that can sometimes have or also involve a lot of rentals or partnerships or collaborations that sometimes the expense side of presenting that work can be a lot higher. The net revenue on those concerts can be a lot lower compared to classic and consistent stalwarts like our Holiday Pops and Messiah. So there's an interesting question here about perhaps organizations making a net revenue decision when they're needing to shape and shift around in the programming, that perhaps Holiday Pops and Messiah has more upside from a net revenue standpoint than some other holiday programming. And maybe that's an element of what's driving the strategic decision making here. As I mentioned, we can see some increases in per capita revenue compared to 23 and 25, but not a big increase compared to 24 to 25, but we're continuing to see that increase in the first and last years. The other performing arts sector has seen a bit of a decline in their holiday programming here. So not seeing the level of growth that we're seeing in all of the single ticket market, but there's still some growth there on the holiday side. Same chart as we looked at on single tickets, we're looking at households here and the average number of tickets per order, and a bit of a contrasting trend here from the wider, larger single ticket analysis. So you'll notice that there's a steadiness and maybe a teensy-weensy bit of decline in the number of households buying tickets to holiday product. Again, quite remarkable given a 7% contraction in the number of concerts to only see a 1% contraction in the number of households. So remember that context of opportunities to buy single tickets versus the number of people buying single tickets, that relationship is really important. And again, this in its way shows a sign of strength that we are able to maintain a certain volume of buyers of relationships to our holiday concerts, despite having fewer of them and despite having a contracted prime period. Tickets per order has only declined 2% compared to the 5% that we see in other offerings on the single ticket side. So also interesting to note that when we're investigating what part of our programming is being impacted most by some of this behavior change around the number of tickets per order, is that it's not so much our holiday programming. So that helps us put our attention perhaps to other places if that's a metric we're trying to impact some change on. Frequency, again, pretty flat, pretty stable, and also considerably lower than what we see across all single tickets. So that the takeaway here is that even though many orchestras have lots of product in this time of year, most people are only attending one of one concert within this holiday period at a time. So an important thing to note here is that perhaps this is not a part of the season where we can optimize frequency of attendance. We may want to be doing that in other parts of our season. So some takeaways here, as we talked about, the concert volume has declined in a couple of seasons. Part of that could be around things we can't control, like the calendar, but maybe some of it is considerations around the cost side, the net revenue side of those concerts. But the ticket volume and revenue has contracted a lot less than what we've seen on the concert side. An increase in efficiency despite having fewer opportunities to perform. And even though the overall concert volume has declined, we've seen success in efficiency, really strong results out of growth from Holiday Pops and Messiah concerts in 25 compared to previous seasons. Onward, more charts and graphs. I warned you. I warned you all. But glad to see activity taking place in the chat. We'll press on with these last two sections. I would love to get to some of the questions and comments. So subscription, we're looking at a different time period here. So reorient your brains to February through December of 2025. And again, chosen that time period because it aligns with when the transactions take place for subscribers and members who are buying for the 25-26 season. We're looking at tickets here, not necessarily packages. Everyone counts packages in lots of different ways. Systems handle them in lots of different ways. So the simplest way for us to look at subscription is to just look at the tickets being bought on subscription and then the revenue generated from those tickets. And the good news here is that the number of tickets has risen steadily over the past couple of seasons. That's a 13% increase in subscriber and member tickets between 23-24 and 25-26. Another healthy increase on the revenue side. You'll note the similarities with the wider performing arts sector there, with seeing similar increases in tickets, but larger increases in revenue. And this is where that per cap story and that inflation story starts to diverge and show some distance between the single ticket part of that story and the subscription part of that story. Now we are looking at per capita revenue and households. So the numbers of subscribers and members that we have, that's the purple bar, and then the average price that they're paying for their tickets in the green there. You'll see a bit of fluctuation here, not a lot of growth. The growth in households is not matching the growth in tickets. So we're just seeing 4% growth in subscribers and members. I say just, of course, this is encouraging to see that there are still, at least in aggregate, there is still growing numbers of subscribers. We are still rebuilding back to where things were before the pandemic, but it's encouraging to see this growth. It's just not the same growth that we're seeing in tickets. Per capita revenue is up 5%. This is very similar to what we're seeing in other sectors. So orchestras have grown their households more, and the per capita revenue has been about the same. But that growth in households isn't the same as what we're seeing in tickets. So math nerds, one step ahead, that must mean that they're seeing some changes in the sizes of their packages, right? Our subscribers must be just buying more tickets. And they are, remarkably. So we are looking at the number of households, same as the prior chart in purple, and we are looking at the average number of tickets per package there in the gold. That's a pretty big increase over this time period. It's a 9% increase in the number of tickets per patron, while that 4% increase in the households. So our packages are getting larger. We're seeing this very similar trend in the wider performing arts sector, except a bit more growth on the tickets per patron side of things. The other thing that's interesting about this is, for those of you who remember, we shared similar data in September or October based on the first 6 months of the 25-26 subscription season for from January to from February to July. And what we were seeing in that moment was indications of a really strong subscription campaign. We were seeing numbers well above the prior years within the same period of time. And then when we update that data with the second half of the campaign, basically, that growth disappeared. It's still some of it there, but a lot of that growth disappeared. So what was interesting to us in thinking about this is perhaps an indication. So our hypothesis is that perhaps an indication here is some differences in the phases of our campaigns and in the relationships within those campaigns. So early in campaigns tends to be dominated by renewal behavior. Folks renewing their subscriptions, that's the first part of the campaign. That's the stuff that happens early. That's the data that was dominating the results we were seeing in the initial review of this. And then what's happening in the second half of the campaign is largely acquisition. That's where we tend to see our new customers, our reactivated customers buying as we get closer to the season, we get later in those campaigns. And that's where the growth didn't sustain. So there's something interesting here about seeing perhaps really strong renewal behavior, obviously strong renewal behavior among subscribers buying even more tickets. But maybe that level of growth and momentum not carrying into acquisition. Again, your results may vary, but something interesting here to us about how the trend changed from first half to second half of this 25-26 subscription campaign. So some takeaways from this: encouraging to see that package size is growing, encouraging to see that per capita revenue is growing faster than inflation, encouraging to see just more households, just more people becoming subscribers across the aggregated data set. That's all encouraging. The downside here is this first half, second half story. And if that is showing indications of the sector struggling to acquire enough or to really that part of the campaign maybe not meeting needs or expectations of organizations, even though the renewal side of our subscription campaigns appears to be, again, across the aggregate, performing quite well, and the loyalists are remaining really loyal and in fact expanding their engagement with orchestras. All right, our last data dive is into individual giving. This is switching back to that July to December timeframe, and I want to put some caveats around this data, friends. Individual giving data is really noisy. The data itself is noisy, and that's because the ticketing systems that we study and the complexity around individual giving campaigns, around what counts as an annual fund gift versus a gala gift versus an endowment gift versus a capital campaign gift and soft credits. We recognize these things and trying to exclude corporations and foundations and government giving. We do our very, very best in studying this data and the data feeds coming in from all the organizations to try to organize and compare like for like individual giving campaigns. We're primarily interested in the funds that we see in ticketing systems that, as best we can tell, indicate annual fund. And so when we say annual fund, we're looking for those annualized giving appeals where we're trying to just, every year, bread and butter, renewing and acquiring annual fund donors. But as I said, there's lots of complexity in trying to get that clean. So this data is not as we don't go quite as deep into this, and there's a bit of noise on the individual giving side. So here we are looking at the number of gifts. So in the pink bars, and then the revenue from individuals in the green between 23 and 25. And we can see a 9% increase in gifts. So that's looking strong. The revenue is down a fair amount after growing in 24 into 23. Could this be? How could we see such growth in gifts and such decline in revenue? And that just basically comes down to the size of the gifts, right? And so, as we know in philanthropy, there can be big swings in average gift size if there's kind of special one-off gifts that are really large. So one gift, one donor can have a disproportionate impact on the revenue that we see overall and can swing the average gift size quite wildly. Generally, the trends are similar for the wider performing arts sector. They're seeing an increase in gifts, but an even bigger swing on that revenue side. To see revenue down 30% really just indicates that there were some really big, probably one-time gifts that were coming in 23 and 24 that just weren't part of the picture in 25, even though growth is seen in the number of gifts collected. Next, we're looking at the donors. So first we were looking at the gifts. Now we're looking at the donors. We are interested in this relationship between the number of donors and the number of gifts. I think we keep thinking, hoping maybe that we will start to see um, an increase in the number of gifts on average per donor, either because organizations are encouraging more than one gift a year, or if we see real significant growth in these monthly type, quarterly type sustaining gift programs where one donor may be actually making 12 gifts, 4 gifts throughout the year through automated recurring donations. But to date, we haven't really seen that change very much. It is still basically a 1-to-1 ratio. In fact, it's usually 1.1 gift per one donor. So that's why these bars look relatively similar in terms of the households and the gifts. But that said, we have seen a 10% increase in the number of donors in this time period, 14% decline in the average gift size. So that's really what's fueling that decline in revenue. We keep having more people and they're making more gifts, but basically that average gift size has come down, which could be disproportionately impacted by a relatively small number of people. So the takeaways here on individual giving, this is still really strong signs of engagement, where organizations generally writ large are doing a good job of pulling more people into philanthropy. They're generating more gifts. Perhaps the size of those gifts is going to fluctuate, but I think the fundamentals there are really strong and clear, and that's a good sign. We would just love to have more people. It is always a good sign to have more people wanting to engage with us philanthropically. So we will take that. We will just want to understand the context around that average gift size and the types of gifts that are coming in and how that's impacting our revenue. And that's what can put real pressure on development teams to manage, right? Big changes in gifts. Development teams also struggle in terms of helping to keep average gift sizes in pace with inflation. They struggle with this far more than our colleagues in marketing do. It's relatively easy to adjust ticket prices each year to try to keep pace with inflation. It's really difficult to do so in charitable giving. But I'm sure you can think of many donors in your organization for whom they've been giving you $500, $1,000 every year for the past, who knows, 8, 9, 10 years perhaps, and your most loyal donors. But that $500 to $1,000 8 years ago just doesn't have the same impact on the organization as it does today, as it did back then. And oftentimes there's a real lack of intentional, thoughtful, strategic efforts to increase the average gift size of even that widest base of our donors. And so it's just inherently more difficult, but an important challenge to think about for development departments, because we're doing quite well at getting more people to give. We need to be thinking about how to keep pushing that average gift size up, and without relying upon the wild swings of those big one-time, but perhaps potentially inconsistent larger gifts. Okay, I'm going to stop my screen share there. That is all the data. Thank you, everyone, for hanging in there, and we do have some time to get into your questions and comments.
That's great. Thank you so much, Brad. So I think I want to go back to fairly early in your presentation, and I think it was the point about the truncated period during which holiday sales, things that could fall into the classic definition of what a holiday event is, the extent to which that's a fact in Canada. And not merely the U.S. Of course, U.S. Thanksgiving being its
Right.
own, I don't know, the whole business of having a Thursday holiday and expecting anybody to go back to work on Friday just makes my brain hurt. Uh, so that's a question about the pertinence of that. Someone
Yeah.
else, though, noted that things like Cyber Monday and Black Friday sales,
Mhm.
which, despite the fact that it's not a Canadian holiday, may still be an opportunity seized by some Canadian organizations to launch special promos. So I think I haven't quite framed it as a question, but just sort of a messy summary of what I saw in the chat. Any comments?
Yeah, so no, it's entirely fair to and appropriate to note the the disproportionate impact of a kind of within the data set, right? There's still the data set we're looking at is still predominantly American orchestras. There are, a handful of Canadian orchestras. So right, that those trends are just not going to pop quite as much, and absolutely right, but also really astute. So while that challenge may not be the same challenge in Canada as it is to our colleagues in America, but um, it is a really good observation around, and I'm based in the UK and work with organizations on both sides. And I've noticed even in the organizations I work with in the UK, even orchestras, that Black Friday is a global event. Black Friday that has become, you may not have adopted things American Thanksgiving at that time. I know you have Canadian Thanksgiving, but at that time, it is American capitalism has certainly had its influence on Black Friday and Cyber Monday in particular, and which means it is an opportunity, right? It doesn't have to be related to that one American holiday. That has become a wider cultural retail moment globally that organizations can take advantage of for sure. And there's results there that we see even outside of the States around those moments.
Right. I also want to reflect on something that I tapped into the chat fairly early on, looking at the relatively, this was single ticket sales. And you're sort of no news here. The relative flatness of results from 23, 24, and 25. And I said, sure would be educational to chart year-to-date single ticket sales volume and revenues against other revenue categories over that period of time, and also then chart it against expenses, because I think this may be the big pinch, right? Um,
Yes.
no news is good news. No movement is at least not a decline, but charted against the reality that we're hearing about, which is an increase in
Yeah.
expenses. Um, it may feel like never enough.
Yeah, you are absolutely right. Really well summarized, Catherine. This is the record scratch moment. This is the like, but wait a minute, why does it feel so hard? And it is, even though we are working so hard, we are actually bringing in more people. They are maybe not buying as many tickets with each visit as they used to, but we are working so hard to bring in more people, and we are trying to inch our ticket prices up, and it still just doesn't quite feel like enough. And that is in part because the needs on the expense side of our business have just continued to grow at a much larger pace than our ability to grow on the revenue side. And so I think that's a really important thing to understand, is to dig into some of those underlying metrics on the revenue side to try to help folks understand, well, where can I focus? Because we can't, like, more is more is more is more. We're always going to feel like more. And we might need to start to take really almost precise action within some of these underlying metrics, instead of just saying, I just got to sell more tickets. I got to find a way to get more people in the hall. It's like, well, but if I could do a little more on per cap, if I could do a little more on average order size, if I could do a little bit more on frequency, all of that starts to have a multiplier effect. If we can really focus our attention on some of those individual underlying metrics to help close that gap. But you've described it perfectly. It's all easier said than done, but
Yeah.
hopefully folks can see what those dials are.
Right. And I think there's a couple of other reflections. One of the things that I dropped into the chat was a link to a couple of very preliminary handbooks that have been developed as a result of a project we're involved in called Reimagining Customer Relationships. And it
Oh,
is a participant-driven research exercise where we're looking at different ways to drive what we're describing as loyalty. to
Mhm.
performing arts organizations. And the very first project was to do some interviews with people that performing arts organizations had identified as initiators, those beautiful people who organize outings to performing arts events for their friends and family. And, it's not immediately obvious who those folks are in your database, but odds are good if you talk to your box office manager, they will know those people who are buying for groups. This is not,
Yeah.
bus tours or
Nope.
seniors' homes bringing in a load of seniors to an event. This is individuals and just trying to sort through what makes those folks tick, what
Yeah.
kinds of strategies might work to support them better, and how can you find more people who are like that, who might be willing to take the lead on organizing those really life-changing and life-enhancing
Yep.
outings for friends. So I threw that in there because it's the very first product from this work, but I think it speaks very much to Brad's comments about looking at what some precise focused initiatives, what something might look like that might sell you 10 or 15 or 20 more concerts to households that are already in your database. So just sort of thinking about how,
Love
what
it.
some precise initiatives might be. And, sorry to grab your time, but I just wanted to
No, no, no.
little,
That's
little,
excellent. It's speaking my love language there. That is what we're dealing in every day. And I what I would add to that is so one example or one tactic there might be is we are big fans and have done a lot of work and research around use of the net promoter system in arts and culture. And what's important about the net promoter system is I'm sure many of you have experienced it. You just may not know it. Is you've probably been asked at some retail organization about how likely are you to recommend to a friend or family member, 0 to 10, like that kind of question, as being what the creators call the ultimate question. That is all we need to know, because the aim is to have more promoters out into the world than we have detractors, which is exactly what you're describing, Catherine. Like that's the pathway to loyalty. If we have more people out there who are saying good things, and those are those influencers, those ambassadors, those engagers, what we often do with our surveys, even if you are implementing something like this, what most organizations are doing is they're putting disproportionate attention to their detractors. They're taking the survey information and they're responding to the negatives and trying to, oh, I got to fix this. We heard people don't like this and they don't like that. And while that is part of it, we're not listening enough to our promoters. We're not engaging with our promoters enough. We feel good. It's a nice pat on the back. Oh, they liked the concert. Oh, that's great. But actually, here's a promoter and a person who bought an above average number of tickets. That is data that we can get and manage and monitor relatively easily. That should be a big opportunity flag to engage that person more deeply in the way that you described. Asking our promoters, how could we make your experience even better, is can be a more productive way at improving that NPS score and improving that balance of
yeah.
promoters over detractors. Yeah.
And the interesting thing there is, we're talking about charts and graphs. We're also talking about individual relationships with
Oh, for
individual
sure.
people with strong opinions,
Yes.
loves, and passions. So,
Yes. Yeah.
it kind of brings it all together. Another great question from Brenda, and that is, and I think this was in response to the subscription information. Does an
Mhm.
older and this is orchestras versus the world, the other
Yeah.
performing arts organizations that you were tracking, does an older and wealthier demographic among our concert goers contribute to our being able to maintain ticket sales?
Um, Good question. The short answer is yeah. Um, your demographic isn't wildly older or wealthier than the wider arts and cultural market in research that we've done. It is a little, but not significantly so. And what's interesting is that this is going to become a challenge. The demographic shifts that are approaching are becoming a challenge. We're starting to see boomer generations recede in their proportion of both our ticket buyers and our subscribers. We're starting to see the level of interesting Gen X folks level off and level off sooner than what we saw boomers who were in a when they were in a similar at a similar life stage. Where the fastest growth is taking place on both single ticket buying and subscription is in millennial and in Gen Z. Now, fast growth of a small proportion, but fast growth nonetheless. The other two larger pieces of the pie there aren't growing, and in fact, they're flat or declining. And so, I do think it's really, and that's a look. We're talking big picture, long term trends, very broad and aggregate stuff, right? But I do think starting to have real awareness about what's going to happen, that the decline of boomers is not going to be replaced by the growth amongst Gen X, and that decline may come faster than we are able to realistically grow the engagement of millennials and Gen Z. So there is something to be thinking about there in terms of the big picture longitudinal planning for organizations.
Right. Okay. I love that because again, it's a reminder of the complexity of audiences and perhaps the challenges of typecasting. And as someone who I recently discovered is actually a late boomer as opposed to an X person. Okay, people, we got to keep on going. So I think I'm looking at the clock. It's 2:59. So I think at this point we'll need to wrap it up. I draw your attention to the various notes that my colleagues have put in the chat as well. And just so grateful as always for your generosity and clarity in presenting an interesting and illustrative picture of what's going on out there. I'd also like to thank Isabella, our intrepid simultaneous interpreter.
Thank you, Isabella. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you for making us sound smart in both official languages as much as possible under the circumstances. And we will be continuing to present more data with and from TRG Arts. So very grateful. Watch our newsletter, website, and social media for updates. I look forward to seeing you again. Have a wonderful week and, have a great time in Sioux City, Iowa, Brad. Great to
Thank you,
connect.
Catherine.
Thank
Appreciate
you,
it.
everyone.
Thanks,
Thank
everybody.
you. See you soon.